Hey, well, what's up, Colliders? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here, and if the Barbie pink aesthetic was not your cup of tea this week, Hollywood's got you covered with a movie with a much different flavor. Oppenheimer, the new film by esteemed director Christopher Nolan, just hit theaters. I've seen it, so let's talk about it. So kind of a lot like his 2017 war film Dunkirk, Christopher Nolan is sort of stepping out of his science fiction wheelhouse to deliver a story more based on like real life and history, which is Oppenheimer, telling the kind of the based on a true story, real life story of Robert Oppenheimer, and the creation of the atomic bomb, which I think the movie is sort of based on a biography, American Prometheus, which came out several years ago. And I will say up front, I'm a big Christopher Nolan fan. I love almost all of his movies. And I do think, once again, with Oppenheimer, he definitely lives up to his reputation. This is a masterfully constructed story that somehow both manages to be like harrowing and like somber while entertaining at the same time. This is a triumph, although unfortunately it comes with one pretty substantial caveat, which we will get into. So why don't we start with sort of the positives of this? As you might expect from just like seeing the trailers, the cast of this movie is tremendous. Just sort of this almost like a symphony of just different personalities that somehow all seem to be just hitting the perfect note in their role. Kind of the always great Cillian Murphy is once again just super captivating in his performance as Oppenheimer, and just the ability to kind of communicate the deep like inner turmoil that's going on as he's creating this bomb with just sort of the look in his eyes or gestures. Just a great performance, which I'm sure will get recognition once the award season kind of rolls around. Others like Iron Man, Robert Downey Jr., and then Matt Damon are also excellent. And even like small roles in this film, which only maybe even like for a single scene appear, are played by actors you'll recognize, great, talented actors, just all nailing it across the board. But perhaps unsurprisingly, kind of the real star of Oppenheimer is director Christopher Nolan himself. Kind of once again, as he's kind of true to the reputation that he's earned, he kind of breaks the mold of conventional expected storytelling. Near the beginning of this film, there's a kind of an interesting, unusual scene that didn't quite make sense to me in the moment, and kind of in hindsight made a little bit more sense, where there's like a series of images that are shown in a quick succession. Like there's a Picasso painting, and there's like a record player, and it's moving around and around. And in some ways, though, that sort of sequence acts as a bit of like a metaphor for the movie itself, that this is introducing a story that is not going to unfold in like a linear chronological narrative, but that it is going to be a little bit more like circular, a little bit more like wider thematic in its approach. And kind of like the aforementioned Dunkirk, this film is divided into multiple timelines, kind of multiple events, because hey, there wouldn't be a Nolan film without just messing around with time in some way or form. And kind of each of the periods is distinguished by like a different aesthetic style, like the vivid colors of sort of the Oppenheimer's like present experiences, and then there's like the black and white, which is sort of showing like the consequences, sort of what happened after the bomb. And even the movie itself, kind of using title cards, does like distinguish that there's sort of these two separate parallel stories that are unfolding, which it names fission and fusion, which are sort of scientific terms that I don't understand because I'm just a humble movie reviewer. But it does, like the first centers on the creation of the bomb, and the other time period is like the aftermath, sort of living in the consequences of what happened from those events. And the movie jumps back and forth between these different time periods, sometimes in like jarring and abrupt ways, where like a scene almost stops like mid-scene and a moment gets played and then abandoned. Then it's not till much later in the movie that it returns, and you sort of understand the context of what's going on. And I think that approach kind of combined with what I think, again, is an incredible musical score that plays almost all throughout, kind of underlining this movie, which adds like this sort of weird, dreamlike, surreal quality to the events. And I do think it will probably take viewers just a little bit of time to get into the rhythm of the nonlinear story and kind of understand, like, that this isn't going to be just a chronological historical telling of what happened. But I think kind of in a more like symbolic sense of, you know, sort of the chain reaction of atoms and the stuff going on in the film, there is sort of, in the way that Nolan unfolds the story, there is a connectivity of, you know, what is happening, the theory, you know, of making the bomb and how that is directly connected to the consequences. And kind of by experiencing both those things at the same time, it just gives you a different, kind of unique perspective on both of those time periods. And really the vast majority of a 3 hour, it's a long movie, 3 hour runtime is really just given to rooms full of a bunch of dudes talking, different contexts, either scientists or politicians. And there's a lot of just dialogue and characters talking, which in theory might seem boring or dull, but because of Nolan's ability to make that like escalating sense of tension and the stakes and just sort of the awareness of like the horror that is coming, that this movie, despite, you know, just being a long movie of a lot of talking, it moves at a brisk pace. It is very rarely boring. Only until about the last 30 minutes of this movie you start to feel the length, and it does seem like it's dragging a little bit. But for the most part, this movie just flies by. And the standout moment is probably what's to be expected, is the detonation, like the Trinity test of the first time they test the bomb, which is a sequence which shows Nolan at his best, definitely building tension, sort of the way that they use the music and just the sound design and the visuals. It is this immersive sort of edge your seat, hold your breath spectacle, which definitely is the highlight of this film. Unfortunately, Oppenheimer does not always show Christopher Nolan at his best. I think he excels when he's doing things that other filmmakers just can't or aren't willing to do, like mess around with like the linear stuff and, you know, explode an atomic bomb using only practical effects and kind of pushing the boundaries. So I think it is noticeable that kind of the one big caveat that disrupts this movie is probably the most non-Nolan-esque aspect of this film, and that is the sex and nudity. So Nolan has always sort of been noted for being like detached or cold when it comes to like the relationships. Like his you know, sexually, his films are very sanitized. He has never explored that area. So this is sort of the first time that he kind of wades into that kind of material. And the result of that is just some completely unnecessary, I think just totally gratuitous scenes of sex and nudity, which comes across feeling very kind of unusually reactionary for Nolan, that he's sort of responding to the critics rather than just sort of doing what makes sense for the film. And perhaps I'm just a prudish Christian reviewer, but I think it's beyond like the regular just moral complications of nudity in film. There is also just something quite distasteful in a film that really only has two prominent female characters in the whole cast, and then to reduce one of those, who happens to be a brilliantly talented actress, Florence Pugh, to reduce, you know, one of your two female characters to essentially just a sexual object that spends virtually all of her screen time nude. Maybe one other critique, if the lack of restraint with the sexual stuff is an issue, I think maybe the other issue is Nolan maybe having too much restraint when it comes to some other areas, particularly with like the horror element of the bomb. Kind of the horror of that is just sort of hinted at, is alluded to. It's never, you don't see the bombs actually dropped on the cities. You know, the story is told from Oppenheimer's perspective, and because he didn't see those things, the audience doesn't see those things. There is sort of a moment later where a room full of people are like looking at pictures and talking about the aftermath, but the camera centers exclusively on Oppenheimer's sort of troubled face. So as the audience, you never really see the consequences of the bomb itself. I think there's a very valid argument to be made that kind of doing that is a way to not reduce a very real world horrific event to the level of just sort of cheap entertainment and like making a spectacle out of it. I do get that, but I do think personally in a movie that is very much trying to shine a light on just like the horrible implications of this creation, I think that message would have come across a bit more powerfully and meaningful if, as the audience, you got a greater sense of like the actual horrors rather than a more kind of sanitized version of that. As far as content to consider, things on the surface of this, there are multiple F-bombs in this movie. I didn't get an exact count, but I would guess between 4 or 5 F-bombs, as well as sort of a handful of other profanities, and maybe one or two other like crude innuendos that characters say to each other. Violence, like I said, despite being a movie based on one of the most horrific, violent moments in all of human history, the movie itself doesn't necessarily visualize that violence in any kind of explicit way. You hear people talking about it, and the implication, you don't see a whole lot of it. And kind of the one exception to that, the one way that Nolan does try and communicate that, is that Oppenheimer kind of has these visions, like at the end of his like post-bomb, where he's struggling with what he did, and it's sort of like in different rooms and settings, he sort of sees these people almost suffering the consequences. Like you see one female in the crowd, and like her face, like the skin on her face is like peeling off, and it's a very brief scene. And then he also, in that same scene, he steps forward and like steps into the empty chest cavity of like a charred corpse. So you do get a little bit of sort of that violence, although maybe not as much as you might expect. And like I said, as far as sexuality, this is where there's the most, as far as content goes, just sort of several moments of what I think is this sort of gratuitous, over-the-top, needless sex. There's one scene where Pugh's character and Oppenheimer, they're having sex in his hotel or his apartment, and her bare chest is fully exposed, and you see them having sex on the bed. In another scene, which is where Oppenheimer's in like a conference room with men, and they're questioning his relationship with this girl because she's a communist, and a whole bunch of stuff going on. And like, as the camera pans, all of a sudden Oppenheimer's naked, and then she appears, and she's naked, and she's on top of him, and she's thrusting, and they're having sex like in this conference room, which is meant in like more of like a figurative way, obviously, than literal. But again, they're both nude there. And then there's kind of a third instance where they meet up in a hotel, and they've had sex again, and you don't see the sex necessarily in that moment, but then like afterwards, they have a conversation. They're both sitting in chairs, and they're both fully nude. Obviously, you don't see the male bits, but you do see her exposed chest for the duration of this conversation. So there is definitely, I think, over the top with the nudity in that way. And then also just sort of in a more implied sense, Oppenheimer is often described like as a womanizer, and people reference the fact that he's sort of being promiscuous with other like married women and other characters in the film, although the film itself doesn't show those. As far as themes, kind of things going on beneath the surface of this film, kind of a couple things that this film is doing that is interesting. Obviously, a lot of the movie focuses on like the same kind of moral quandaries and stuff that were a result of like the actual historical events, such as did the ends justify the means, and were we justified to drop the bomb? Was Japan going to surrender? Who has blood on their hands? Who's to blame for the act? And kind of the film does address some of those expected kind of questions and of morality and kind of ethical stuff in the film. But kind of on the side of that, there's also, this movie becomes a chance for Nolan to explore kind of more classic, kind of Nolan-esque themes as well. And kind of the main one is the idea of like that theory can only take you so far. There's multiple instances in this film where Oppenheimer makes statements along those lines, saying theory can only take you so far, telling a character what can you expect from theory alone. And just sort of expressing the limitations of what theory can prove and not prove. And at one point, Matt Damon's kind of military admiral character is asking for like certainty with theory, and Oppenheimer kind of makes an interesting remark that, hey, once we drop this bomb, then we'll know for certain whether we blew up the world or not. But you can only, at some point, you got to just act on it. You can't have all certainty from theory. And you see that expressed other times as well. And obviously, the film isn't necessarily framing that in like a religious, Christian, spiritual sense. Although I do think there are some obvious implications for just how much can you believe? What is the difference between like believing in something and acting upon it? And the film showcases that in even with like the Communist Party and different ideologies and kind of beyond just religious stuff, but definitely interesting stuff for Christians to unpack with that. So in the end, Oppenheimer I think will be a complicated movie for Christians to kind of put their finger on. On the one hand, it is an excellently crafted, executed, and directed movie. This is everything that I think it lives up to the hype in those senses. Is Nolan kind of showcasing his abilities when he's kind of going at his best, which would be a very easy recommendation from me, if not for sort of the sexual elements that are scattered throughout this movie. It's sort of the paradox, I think, for Christians that this is a movie definitely designed to be fully experienced on a big screen. Although I think maybe for some viewers it might be wiser to wait and watch this at home and you have a bit more control. But hey, however you choose to watch this, if you do watch it or if you don't watch it, see it in theater, see it at home. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Did this live up to the hype? Did you enjoy this movie? Were you disturbed by it? Any of those things, jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about that. If you haven't done so, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel, become a Collider. We'll just love to have you guys join with what we're doing here. But most of all, guys, thanks for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.